Hi everyone and welcome to Unit 6.1 of the Boost-In Massive Open Online course. My name is Daniela Fuchs and I work at the Center of Social Innovation, a social science research institute based in Vienna. And today I will be talking about why public perception matters when it comes to new technologies. Public perception and the potential risks of new and emerging technologies have been discussed extensively in the literature, especially with the debate on genetically modified organisms, GMOs, in the 1990s. Back then, the risk perception of experts and the public, meaning people without specific expertise on the technology at stake, differed considerably. In Europe, protests delayed and prevented the market introduction of GMOs. These protests affected how new technologies should be governed in the future. Basically, ever since then at latest, administrative bodies and researchers consider the topic of public perception when talking about new technologies. This is especially important when the technologies at stake are directly linked to issues of health and well-being. This is the case when they are taken up and digested, for example. In this regard, water is essential, and this means that when we think about reusing and recycling water, we need to consider public perception carefully. What are concerns regarding these technologies? Is this something people want and feel safe with, or would they prefer a different solution? Exploring viable options for all is important from an ethical and a social perspective, but also from an economic one. Public perception of a technology may considerably affect whether the implementation of a technical solution will be successful, especially when dealing with such an essential resource like water. In this video, I draw from discussions on emerging technologies like nanotechnologies to explain general points of how public perception of technology forms and which factors affect the assessment of risks of the public, meaning laypeople. You can find the literature at the end of this video and in the reading material. To start with, it is important that we acknowledge that from a governance perspective, the risk perception of the public mostly becomes an issue when risk assessments between the public and experts differ. In short, traditionally, anticipating rejection of new technologies or applications is one driver for engaging with the public perception of risks. However, the question of how the public perceives risks on new technologies is not easy to answer. Usually, experts and administration assumed that more and better information and education automatically would result in a positive public perception of technologies. This is known as the deficit model. The public is diagnosed with a knowledge deficit, which is to be cured by more and more accurate information on the topic. However, empirically speaking, providing more information on the issue at stake often is not enough to change a negative perception of new technologies. Hence, the deficit model falls short in explaining resistance towards new technologies. Of course, information and knowledge are important and contribute to changing perceptions of risks, but they are not always sufficient to explain acceptance, rejection, or ambivalence of people towards new technologies or applications. Instead, other aspects play a role in how laypeople evaluate risks. Consequently, it is important to consider different perspectives when developing, testing, implementing, or governing new technologies or applications. How risk perception is formed individually is still subject to research. What you can see here are a few factors that affect how people perceive risks, defined by the German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment in the context of nanotechnology. There are object-related factors, meaning that there is a tendency that the more people are familiar with the topic, the more they refine the risk perception of the technology at stake. There are socio-demographic factors, meaning that attitudes are linked to individual or milieu-specific characteristics like gender, level of education, or age. And there are psychosocial factors, which allow insights on associations and internalized patterns, which are linked to cultural embedding and subjective intuition, like the extent of trust in representatives of science or institutions. And last but not least, there are other factors, like the reception of scientific media or media in general. This study also found that people tend to avoid emerging internal conflicts with existing criteria or positions. Thus, they tend to fill knowledge gaps in risk assessment with emotional basic attitudes. Regarding water, the yuck factor falls into this category. The yuck factor is the immediate and instant disgust that some people feel toward new applications. For example, reusing treated wastewater or some biotechnical applications like bio-nanotechnologies or GMOs. Factors that affect such emotional basic attitudes are manifold, but could comprise political opinions, opinions on the relationship between technology and nature, or religion. Studies found that people's risk assessment often differ affected by these attitudes, even when receiving the same information beforehand. This indicates that information is pre-selected internally according to cultural values. In general, experts and lay people evaluate risks differently. Lay people tend to perceive risks as higher and emphasize the severity of damage rather than the probability of occurrence. Yet there are a lot of features that tend to make people prone to taking risks. You can see a few of these features listed here. People tend to take more risks if the risk is natural or reversible, if they are familiar with the situation or the source of risks, if there are few fatal consequences and impacts are short-term, if benefits and risks are distributed fairly, if they trust the source of information, if the information is clear, if they are in control, or they trust public control to handle this, and a lot of others. So what does this all mean? With this short webinar, I try to first show that public perception matters considerably when thinking about introducing new technologies into society. This is a general important point, not only for solutions on recycled water. Second, I showed how and why the perception of risks between experts and the public may differ considerably, and provide some factors that affect the public's perception of risk. I conclude that there is no one-size-fits-all way to consider public perception in relation to new technologies. One way to address this could be to enter into a continuous dialogue to explore stakeholders' hopes and concerns regarding specific topics, not necessarily restricted to specific technological solutions, and to work on viable solutions together. Here are a few suggestions that may help such a dialogue on risks of new technologies. First, transparency in communication and action is key. Like unbiased and impartial information allows people to gather information on the topic and technology and to form their own opinions. Here, independent communication is crucial. Second, the debate on public perception roots in concerns that people may still reject new technologies and practices, such as reusing water or using recycled water for drinking. Taking their concerns seriously, responding to their reasoning and risk perceptions, and keeping discussions on solutions open is crucial to ensure that people support solutions. Third, trust in institutions cannot be ranked high enough. On one hand, regarding communication, this affects whether people consider information as trustworthy. On the other hand, institutional trust is crucial when it comes to controlling risks, especially in the context of potable reuse of water. Obviously, these points are highly intertwined. Transparency and engagement can be regarded as a kind of precondition for institutional trust. And with this in mind, we move on to the Boost-in example of how to build strategies for enhancing awareness in video 6.2. If you're interested in reading a little bit more on the topic, please find the reference here. Thank you a lot for listening, and see you in video 6.2.